Hi there, everybody, and welcome to today's Art of Procurement podcast. I am your host, as ever, Philip Ideson. And on the show today, I actually welcome two guests. I welcome Geraldine Craven, who is the head of research at Procurement Leaders, and David Ray, who is Procurement Leaders' chief product officer. And in today's pod, we dig into a recently published study that Procurement Leaders undertook in cooperation with Bain Consulting to understand what is changing for procurement as 2020 approaches and what is staying the same. Well, in our conversation, we'll focus on how leading procurement teams are driving value beyond savings. There's a number of different value levers that we talk about before going deeper into a few of those different areas, such as supplier-enabled innovation. Supplier-enabled innovation is actually an area that Procurement Leaders has a lot of insight. In fact, David launched their Supplier-enabled Innovation Center back in 2016. So as always, as we go into the podcast, I start by asking Geri and then David if they found procurement or if procurement found them.
So in this instance, procurement found me. I have a background in research, so originally in social and government research. And when I recently moved to the UK, I found a role as in the research team within Procurement Leaders. And I'm currently heading up the research team there. So using traditional research methods, but really focusing on the procurement industry specifically and what's in store for the future.
Okay, and how long have you been around the procurement community now?
So I've been with Procurement Leaders for just under a year, so still very new to the industry and still learning a lot.
David, same question really for you as well. I'd love to know your kind of procurement origin story. How did you get involved in this profession?
Sure, yeah. So I guess procurement also found me, but it was quite a long time ago. It was getting on for 12 years ago now that it found me. I came from a journalist background, but I did a lot of work in the finance world. I reported on the financial markets and reported on issues for chief financial officers. Also had a stint in the technology world, so I was reporting and writing for a series of technology and technology titles and telecoms titles. But yeah, so it was about 12 years ago that I got approached to join Procurement Leaders and been here ever since. So there must be something about the profession.
It's one of those things, like I would say 99% of the people that I talk to, whether it's through the podcast or I'm often asking the question just offline, and I think we're all in the same boat. I was exactly the same as well. It's one of those things where you often, you don't really know what procurement is, and you find yourself there, and all of a sudden you're taken by, having such a good broad perspective, I think, of the business. For me, that was one of the attractions that you don't necessarily get in other places.
Yeah, the other question I quite like is, would you recommend a career in procurement to your kids? I mean, that's always a good one as well.
So what's your answer to that one then?
I think I would. We will get on probably later to some challenges to that statement, but I think it's diverse and interesting if you get to the right level in the right organization.
So I want to dig into the 2020 CPO Planning Guide that you recently published. So just to learn a little bit more about what you're seeing out there in the marketplace. And Geri, I think the question may be for you really to start digging into this. Before I go there, I just wonder if you could share a little bit about the research methodology used. Who are the kind of folks who are engaging in the survey, just to give a little bit of a context for what we're going to talk about afterwards.
Yes, so we partnered with Bain in this instance to be able to broaden the network and make sure that we were really capturing a diverse range of industry, geography, and making sure that we were really connecting with CPOs right across the board. And we surveyed and made sure that the research methodology was reflective of that diverse CPO or CPO equivalent pool. And the survey was an online survey that was distributed through our network and through the Bain network and available online as well. And we also, in leading up to the survey, had undertaken quite a few qualitative interviews and discussion groups with our network of membership, our members as well. And so the results and the actual insights that are within the CPO Planning Guide are a reflection of not only the survey findings, but the conversations that we've had throughout the year as well, and discussion groups that we've had with our CPOs in the network as well. So it's a reflection on the topics that are really at the forefront of their mind in terms of what they're planning for, but as well as the challenges that they're having to manage going forward as well.
Oh, and what were some of those key findings that came to the fore in the report?
So the key findings really are the need to connect better with the broader C-suite agenda. So really connecting as they're moving away from focusing solely on cost savings and recognizing they need to really change their value proposition and drive more other sources of value for the business. They're having to align more and more with what those other objectives are going to be, whether that's innovation and driving growth, or whether that's providing resilience and protecting the organization. Whatever is the primary goal or primary objective of the C-suite or the CEO, this is going to be the key focus going forward. And it's what we're going to see as a result of that is, whereas procurement teams used to all be very much aligned and all generally doing similar things to drive those cost savings, what we're actually starting to see is a bit more differentiation. So those organizations looking and focusing more on the customer experience or focusing more on innovation or more on risk management are all going to be looking slightly different, and having different focus areas means different activities to support that. So we're starting to see that little bit more differentiation actually between those agendas.
And that's interesting to see, that procurement isn't necessarily one size fits all. Whereas previously, perhaps we grew on that notion that, we have a standard process or procedure, and these are the things that you need to do to be a procurement professional. That it becomes more varied, but also I'd say there's probably room for more creativity, so that we can begin to really look at what the business wants and not necessarily say, hey, we're procurement, this is what we do, but more, we're procurement, how can we align with the goals of the business, and take our lead from that.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned earlier that more and more non-traditional or different backgrounds are being attracted to the function. And that in some ways is a huge asset, because having that different view, having those different connections to the organization and different backgrounds is going to enable the function to move away from that traditional, I sort of call it the shackles of the old ways and old processes that can sometimes hold us back for those transformations that do drive new growth and new and differentiation, and really changing the way in which people are working, but also how and what they do.
Now, I have a question. I'm not sure. Perhaps, David, I know that you're in the field a lot, kind of chatting with CPOs and helping them from a transformation perspective. Do you see that essentially how are procurement leaders actually being able to change the notion of what, like the art of the possible? So, we're moving away from, well, not if we're moving away necessarily, we're building on, the traditional cost savings. But as Geri mentioned, some of those organizations are actually looking for something very different than cost savings. And so we're differing in terms of the value prop we're providing. The actual art of doing that, do you see that it's easier to do so when you're starting from scratch, when you have a transformation and you're kind of reimagining what procurement is, or doing it in flight as you are changing and evolving as the business changes and evolves, so that perhaps cost savings aren't as important?
That's an interesting question, actually, and I don't know if it's possible to say that one is a better route than the other. I would say that cost savings for procurement will always be extremely relevant, and it's never going to go away. By delivering against, on time in full, sustainable cost savings, managing risk, then that's the basics. But by doing it well and doing it efficiently, you're creating the credibility that allows, you to then explore other areas and to get the investment to have success in other areas as well. I mean, one CPO I spoke to recently in the food and beverage sector, he's been handed a war chest, and it's a significant war chest, tens of millions of dollars to go out and use as he wishes. Mm-hmm. And this is from the CEO. It's been negotiated with the CEO, and it's like, use this to go and not to go and play, because that's being flippant, but invest it wisely in order to drive greater value from your function, and whether that's through bringing in innovation scouts or developing new digital capabilities, putting in seed projects to experiment, and not needing an immediate short-term return on that investment. And that you can only get that if you have built up the credibility to start with. Yeah. And that particular CPO has been in their organisation for a little while. They've been on a transformation journey, but I think most CPOs will either be in the midst of a transformation journey, will be about to embark on one, or have just come out of one. So this constant change is all around us. So to start from fresh. I mean, I know another CPO who's gone into a US business recently and is kind of leapfrogging the status quo. Mm-hmm. So rather than working on some of the developments or some of the improvements that we hear from other organizations in the community, she's going, 2 steps forward because she's able to, because there's no sort of foundations there that are proven difficult to evolve. So I don't know if I really answered your question, but I think the credibility that procurement gets from doing what it's supposed to do at its core, at the traditional side, doing that well sustainably is very important. And then on the other side, it's also the being the type of personality who is able to influence at exco level and exco conversations, because a lot of the areas that we talk about with procurement, a lot of the areas of value that we are exploring or hear of our members exploring, it's a risk. There's no guarantee that you're going to get a return. There is an obvious opportunity, and that to get the investment for going after an opportunity like that takes good. You need to be able to put together obviously the business plan, which CPOs are very good at. Yeah. But you also need to convince those, that C-suite that this is worthy of investment rather than something else.
Yeah, and I think you did answer that question. I think maybe it was a long-winded way of talking about, getting endorsement from the C-suites for a change in plans, because oftentimes they only know what we have encouraged them to look at, the procurement value proposition, which was savings based, because it was simpler to get to demonstrate an ROI on that. And so as you not necessarily change costs but build on it, as you mentioned, there's a little bit more risk involved because it's not a straight line of an ROI, but it's actually more impactful for the business. So it requires a change of mindset as well from those who are measuring the value of procurement and how procurement is measured, because it's not just a straight, hey, I saved this much money in savings, and doing a good job, but I'm enabling all these other things that may be a little bit trickier for you to measure.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I was very closely involved in the launch of the Supplier Enabled Innovation Centre here. And when we set that up and when we started working with procurement functions, proving ROI through investments in innovation from the supply base driven by procurement is almost impossible. And we've talked to tens and hundreds of people about it. And, people try and measure, savings as a result of this, try and measure net trade sales. They try and measure all sorts of things. And it's very difficult to really pinpoint the exact contributions that procurement has made to, a trade sale because of the SEI program that was in place.
Yeah.
And that's where the storytelling and the business partnering comes into its own, really.
Yeah, it's funny. I often tell folks that there's a chance of procurement not being seen as a partner, and even a risk to the role of the CPO in that business if you hit all your savings targets, but the rest of the organization don't like necessarily the way you went about doing it. And you've created a lot of problems along the way in doing that. But very rarely do you see a CPO losing their job, for example, or a procurement leader, at a director or even an individual contributor level, losing their role if everybody in the organization is standing up for the value they create, even if they don't necessarily have the numbers to prove it.
Yeah. But then one day, at some point, those numbers will need to be proven. It's kind of business cycles, isn't it? So it's easier to get investment for something in the good times. But then the problem is if that that investment gets taken away, part way through a program before the return is realized, then that's not going to come back anytime soon.
Yeah. What if you don't?
So you need to be, So it's an interesting issue.
So when we go into the report a little bit else, were there any findings that particularly surprised you or that you weren't expecting?
So I think one of the findings that surprised us a little bit is in relation to skills development and talent, because as we go into a period of change and transformation, one might expect that the types of skills that are required would look slightly different. But the skills that CPOs are going to be developing over the next 12 months are actually quite similar to very traditional skill sets. So they're really focusing on stakeholder engagement and influencing, data analysis, and all of these skills are really quite similar to those that have been used by procurement teams in the past. But the difference really is the way in which they're being used, or the focus and how those skills are being used differently. The nature of data is changing, and a quantity of data that I suppose at our disposal to be able to leverage and solve problems and better interpret either the supply chain or our market or our own spend and business. So it's interesting to see that it's not necessarily a change in skill, but really a change of focus. And being clear on what that focus is, being clear on those objectives, is what's going to enable our people and procurement teams to be able to then deliver on those objectives, rather than necessarily a change in skill set.
So one of the things that Geri mentioned there was about the changing nature of supplier relationships. And David, I know that that's something that you've been heavily involved in from the SEI at Procurement Leaders. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, how are our relationships with our suppliers changing? And, are you actually seeing that in practice?
It's a key area, and we are seeing it in practice. Yes, it's still not overly common. It's not something which there's a heck of a lot of best practice around. But it's a key area. If procurement is to successfully evolve from its legacy to this position of real value creation beyond savings, then the supplier relationships have to evolve as well. Supplier relationship management, SRM as a concept, has been around for a long time, but we often hear that there's a lot more emphasis on the management side than the relationship side, and I think this is true. I think also when you look at traditional segmentation, that doesn't help because it's a spend volume or risk approach to segmentation, and that's not always the best place to start. I think driving a partnership approach to how you work with your strategic suppliers, and when I say strategic, I'm not basing that on a risk or spend volume profile. How do you work with those suppliers? How long-term are the agreements that you have in place with those suppliers? What incentives do you have in place to reward your team when working with these suppliers? What incentives do suppliers have in front of them for working with you as a buyer? So, can supplier incentivization models evolve as well? And really what we're talking about is getting to a position where there's joint benefit from the relationship. And obviously there's always been joint benefit, but and you get into a philosophical discussion almost about where, the power play, because traditional power, in a buyer-supplier relationship for the most part has been with the buyer. And that's been leveraged for years and years and years. But, increasingly the size of the pot is probably bigger if you work more collaboratively in some of these relationships and evolve business models and innovate together for the greater good. And that's something we are seeing more and more around, especially with those leading organizations that are playing in this space, that have allocated budget or resource to pursuing innovation or supplier collaboration formally. So yeah, we do see it. We see it in only a minority of organizations, but it's definitely a trend. Yeah.
So I want to ask a kind of follow-on question. You talked about traditional segmentation models not being a great place to start, and I definitely agree, because there's very little in those models that suggests the materiality of a supplier, for example, to whatever the strategy of the business is. As you start to think about supplier-enabled innovation, and somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, I want to start looking and working with suppliers to drive our innovation and to partner with them on their innovation," like, where do you suggest people even start? Are they coming to it looking at, "Hey, these are my most important suppliers, and how do I have them be more innovative?" Or, "This is a challenge the business needs to solve for. How can I partner with suppliers to solve for that challenge?"
Yeah, I think all of those things, or both of those things and more. We've got an approach that we call value-based segmentation. So you're using a concept where you define the value that you're pursuing, and that can be cyclical as well. Business climates change, and sometimes you do have to batten down the hatches, and you do have to think more short term, and you do have to deliver cash back to the business quickly. And if that's the case, and that's the value position that you segment against, and you change the process according to that. But in other times, you're looking for longer term growth, or you're looking for growth opportunities. You're looking for maybe additions to the product portfolio, or enhancements to the product portfolio. You're looking for to break into new markets, to go to adjacent industries, etc. And all these types of strategic drivers have to. And when I say strategic, I mean business. At a business level, at the core corporate strategy, they need to feed into the supplier management, and suppliers need to feed into that strategy for it to be truly successful. And so, yes, category managers should make sure that their strategies are put together with a lens of the value that you're trying to achieve, rather than traditional procurement focused category management category strategies. Looking 10 years out in your category, who are the new players, who are the disruptors, what startups are working in this area, how ripe for disruption, how many ideas are you getting through from your core suppliers in these strategies, how many of those ideas are being translated or having an impact, the feedback, all these sorts of things I think need to be addressed more formally for it to be a success.
Yeah, I feel like one of the most important things there as well is protecting those providers, those partners who you are building stronger relationships and collaborations with when business conditions change. because otherwise you lose all the trust that you try to build up when you have done that, and then business conditions change. And like you say, at times you do need to go and find the cost savings where you can find them, but perhaps approaching that subset of suppliers in a different way, so that you're not damaging all the trust and the benefits that you've derived from those relationships, by engaging with them in a different way.
Yeah, and that you need to be partners in the good times and the bad times,
right?
And that hasn't always been the case, and you can't do that with every supplier. I mean, no. You need to be able, obviously, you need to be able to sort of like go in and take take a slice of margin if required. But if you did that with a company that you don't that's strategic, that you don't then what's the word? Reward when times are good, then that's not they're gonna go elsewhere. They're gonna go to competition with their ideas and innovations.
Well, the other topic I wanted to talk about, just to pull out of the report, was risk management. And it's another one of those topics that I think that we talk a lot about as a procurement profession in terms of a value lever that we can pull. Geri, I mean, are you seeing that that's becoming, that CPOs are investing more in risk management, or kind of what's the state of the union there?
Definitely. We're starting to see a few changes with regards to supplier and third-party risk management in procurement. And partly, yes, to your point, as a value driver, as a new way in which procurement can offer value to the business in terms of building that resilience, but also to be able to support that change in the relationships as well. So there's a couple of things that we're seeing changing. So in the first instance, procurement teams are broadening their definition of risk. So traditionally, financial and operational risks were the key focus, but that's really beginning now to incorporate market, climate, nature impact sort of risks, political and geopolitical risks, and how tariffs are going to be impacting. So being able to be reactive to some of those things, but really also much more proactive. So building mitigation strategies in place, and what that means is that the relationships are going to have to change, because to be able to put in place mitigation activities that really protect the business, you need to have those relationships with operational teams, with legal teams, with all different types of areas within the business to be able to put the right measures in place. But then likewise, the SRM programs are being used in new ways to be able to perhaps educate suppliers or support critical suppliers with their mitigation efforts to make sure that, because the reality is that organizations are more and more on the hook for suppliers right across their supply chain. So being able to firstly have better visibility and transparency of deeper down their supply chain is going to be critical to that. But likewise, once you have that transparency and that visibility, you can't sit on your hands anymore.
Right.
It does require that active involvement and support of suppliers to be able to support them and put those mitigation measures in place. The other big change from a risk management perspective is data. This is an area where data is increasing. We see lots of new players in the market, either supplying third-party data or even building platforms to use that data to create that transparency, and those real-time alerts that we hear more and more are entering procurement teams. And what that means is that to be able to leverage all of the insight and leverage that data, the governance needs to be in place to be able to support that. So we're seeing some transformation as well in terms of the way in which risk is being managed, and that all of that is creating more value. The one challenge for procurement that is wanting to go into this space is if they don't have that endorsement up front, and if they're not able to communicate the value or perhaps the senior executives aren't convinced of the value, it does create a bit of a challenge. So building that business case around how mitigation of risks across the supply chain is going to be the insurance policy or drive that cost avoidance is key to make sure that they then get the support and the resources required for that high level of governance and involvement also right across the business to support those activities. Because realistically, if risk identification and assessment can only do so much, it's really those mitigation activities that are gonna drive the value.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talked about suppliers being so important in that as well. Because when you start looking at proactive risk mitigation measures, that may include contracting with providers in different ways to allow you greater flexibility when things happen, or even contracting with suppliers who aren't necessarily providing something today, but they're there kind of on call in case you need them, in case something else happens. And how do you build relationships with suppliers that enable you to get contracts like that? So it does make for a lot more complexity, but so much more opportunity for us to get involved in protecting against risk events ultimately. The other thing to say is it's great to hear that we're expanding the lens of what risk management, risk mitigation is, because historically it's only been really those regulated industries that have taken a lot of those non-financial risks seriously, and that's because they were required to by their regulators. So now that's becoming more and more kind of standard practice within procurement. I think is great, because we can look at risk a lot more holistically than perhaps we did in the past. So it's about time to start wrapping up the conversation. I just want to finish on 2020. So where do you feel the sentiment of the CPO is as we're heading into a new year, a new decade even? Is it a good time for procurement, a time for worry? What are you hearing and what's coming through in terms of the report?
I think it's an exciting time for procurement. There's a lot of change in the air and a lot of excitement about the opportunities that will come from a shift away from the traditional cost savings to also looking at other ways in which procurement can leverage those relationships with suppliers and that market intelligence in new and exciting ways. Likewise, the ability to tap into and use data in more and more ways as that the breadth and depth and volume of data is only ever increasing. Being able to use that in ways that can support much more strategic decision making is going to be an exciting opportunity for procurement.
Yeah.
And then likewise, being able to work and engage with the organization cross-functionally in new ways that perhaps haven't been done before, and that those are going to be projects that are going to add value and really take the involvement across the board. And procurement has certainly a unique viewpoint and skill set that can support those cross-functional activities as well.
So just to add to that as well, I think that I'm hearing from a lot of the CPOs that I speak to that we are at a bit of a crossroads in the evolution of the function. That there are some headwinds out there which we'll need to address, and we'll need to deliver against those in terms of risk and cost savings. But also, I think with the march of technology and digital, that's freeing up resource in procurement, or has the potential to free up resource in procurement, and that resource then has to be spent on more value-adding activities. And if that isn't spent on more value-adding activities, then it's going to be taken out of the procurement world, and that means that procurement might shrink unless we really go after these other opportunities. And those other opportunities are those that deliver strategic value to the organization, such as innovation, such as sustainability, how we really work with the supply base to impact that area. We've spoken about risk quite a lot, rightfully so. Data insights from the supply chain as well, and making sure that we've got the digital capabilities in place to bring that into to decision making at a strategic level, and also really harnessing the ecosystem of supply. So not just the supply chain, but the supply network. So working with different tiers of suppliers, working with non-traditional suppliers, startups, etc. And that's an exciting but challenging proposition, and it's why we have focused on these areas for our 2020 research theme, which is around aligning with C-suite objectives, and tackling some of these core areas in terms of driving results.
I really appreciate you, David and Geri, taking me through the report. The last question that I have is, if listeners would like to reach out, connect with you, learn a little bit more, what would be the best way for them to do that?
I think the best way to connect with us is just to connect on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
It's a platform there. It's obviously designed for that. We can share a copy of the 2020 report for those who do connect with either myself or Geri. So I'm David Ray, and it's Geraldine Craven. And yeah, we can share that report for you for your listeners to read at their leisure.
Perfect. Well, what I will do is I'm going to include a link to both of your LinkedIn profiles. I'll also include a link to the underlying survey and report that we talked about today, which is the CPO Planning Guide 2020. I'll put those in the show notes, the links to all those in the show notes for today's episode. And that's going to be at artofprocurement.com/episode 283. That's episode 283. So with that being said, David and Geri, I just want to thank you one last time for joining me today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Hi there. I want to thank you for tuning in to today's podcast. You can check out all of our back catalogue at artofprocurement.com/podcast, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter to make sure that you never miss an episode. And if you found value in today's show, I'd love if you would tell a peer, or perhaps go and rate and review by going to artofprocurement.com/review. Word of mouth really is the best way to help the podcast grow, and if you're able to do either one of those things, I would truly appreciate it.